What happens when a man marries 4 women, only to murder 2 of them in cold blood? In this shocking true crime story, the darkness of betrayal and vengeance lurks behind every twist. Stay with us as we dive deep into the mind of a killer who thought he could escape his past, only to find himself trapped in a never-ending nightmare. You won't believe the chilling ending. Keep watching till the very end. You might not sleep tonight. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. The scent of fresh flowers from the garden barely masked the musty air inside. Everything felt off, wrong, as if the house was holding its breath. Inside, there was an unsettling stillness. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, stood by the window. His fingers grazed the cool glass as he stared out into the yard. The moonlight cast a shadow over his face, making it hard to read his expression. His name was Daniel, the man who married 4 women. But something about him seemed empty, unsettling, almost as if his soul had been drained. He had always been charming, the kind of man you couldn't resist. His eyes were deep pools of promise. He made women feel special, desired. But that wasn't the real Daniel. No one could have known that then. His first wife, Sarah, had been the love of his life. Or so it seemed. They built a home together, a family. But it wasn't long before things began to unravel. Late-night whispers, unexplained arguments. The tension grew like a heavy storm, and soon, Sarah was gone. Just vanished without a trace. Neighbors thought she'd left him. But Daniel knew better. The second wife, Emma, was different. She was young, bright-eyed, full of life. She didn't suspect the darkness that lurked behind Daniel's smile. He promised her the world, and she believed him. But her fate was sealed the moment she signed those vows. She was found one morning, lifeless, cold. No one could explain how it happened. The police were baffled. There were no signs of struggle, no clues. Daniel's grief seemed genuine, but no one questioned him. Not yet. But then came Rachel, his third wife. By now, people were starting to talk. There were whispers in the neighborhood. But Daniel's charm remained undeniable. Rachel didn't listen to the warnings. Her love for him blinded her. But something changed in the air. A tension, like the calm before a storm. The house felt colder this time. More oppressive. She could feel it but couldn't understand it. And then, the unthinkable happened. Rachel vanished without a trace. The silence in the house was unbearable. Daniel stood there, frozen. The shock of it settling over him like a thick fog. Was it happening again? Was he losing control? He hadn't planned it. But the darkness inside him had taken over once more. The phone rang, slicing through the silence. Daniel's hand shook as he reached for it. A voice on the other end, frantic, uncertain. Rachel's missing, Daniel. Where is she? His heart pounded in his chest. But his voice remained calm, controlled. I don't know, he said, his words cold. I'll look for her. But deep down, he already knew the truth. The darkness had claimed her, just like the others. Rachel was gone, and now the house felt emptier than ever. As he hung up the phone, the walls seemed to close in around him. The house, once full of promises and laughter, now felt like a tomb. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on his chest. The guilt, the remorse, it was all a game to him now. His next move had to be perfect. It always was. But what about wife number 4? Her name was Clara, a quiet woman with a gentle smile. She had no idea what she was walking into. She had no idea how carefully Daniel had planned everything. Clara's arrival was met with the same promises of love, safety, and devotion. She didn't know the dark truth. Not yet. But Daniel's mind was racing. How could he keep her? How could he make her his, without suspicion? He had learned from his past mistakes. This time, he would be smarter. He would cover his tracks better. Days went by, and Clara seemed blissfully unaware. She believed in him, just as the others had. But Daniel felt something change. There was a shift in the air. Clara was asking too many questions. She was beginning to notice the cracks in his story.
She was starting to dig.
And that was the one thing Daniel could not allow. He had to stop her. And he did. One night, after dinner, while Clara was washing the dishes, he stood behind her. His presence, unsettling, made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She turned around, startled by his closeness. Daniel smiled, that same charming smile. But there was something different in his eyes. A coldness. A hunger. Clara tried to back away, but his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. The grip was too tight. She struggled, her heart racing in her chest. "Let go," she screamed. But Daniel's eyes didn't flinch. The moment felt suspended in time. She could see the darkness in him now. The things she'd only heard rumors about. The things she never believed. And as he pushed her down, the last thought that crossed Clara's mind was that she was no different than the others. She was just another victim of the man she thought she loved. Clara's breath was shallow, frantic, as she fought against him. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The room felt like it was spinning, every motion slow, deliberate. Daniel's grip tightened, cold and unyielding. She could barely breathe, let alone scream. Her vision blurred, and in that moment, she realized the terrifying truth. She had trusted him. She had believed in the lies. But now, the world was slipping away. Daniel's eyes locked onto hers. He didn't blink. His expression was unreadable. It was like he was watching her, studying her, waiting for the life to leave her body. And then, with a sharp movement, he let go. Clara collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. Her chest heaved with desperation. She was trembling, too terrified to move. Daniel stood over her, his presence suffocating. "I told you," he whispered, his voice strangely calm. "I told you this would happen if you didn't listen." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't look away. Her mind raced, trying to find a way out, but everything felt hopeless. This wasn't just about love anymore. It was about control.
Power.
And he was the one who held it all. The weight of her situation pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. She was trapped. But she wasn't going down without a fight. Clara gathered all the strength she had left. She scrambled to her feet, backing into the corner of the room. Her heart was still pounding, but something inside her snapped. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He stood there, staring at her for a moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Because I'm a man who gets what he wants." Clara's stomach twisted in horror. But she wasn't done yet. She had one last chance. With a swift movement, she grabbed a sharp knife from the counter. It was her only hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the weight of her own resolve.
She was going to fight back.
But Daniel's laugh stopped her. It was cold, mocking. "You think you can escape me?" he sneered. Clara's grip tightened on the knife, but her hands were trembling. She was afraid. She was terrified. But she wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. And then, in a blink, everything changed. Daniel lunged. Clara's scream echoed through the house. But it was too late. The darkness had already consumed her. Daniel stood over her once more, breathing heavily. He had done it. Again. And in the silence that followed, he knew something had shifted inside him. The thrill of it. The power. The control. This would never stop. It never did. He had tasted it. And now, there was no turning back. The house was still, silent once more. The quiet was deafening. Daniel stood frozen, staring down at Clara's lifeless body. The blood was still fresh, staining the floor beneath her. The scent of it filled the room. It was intoxicating. His chest rose and fell, slow and heavy, as he took it all in. He had done it. He had crossed the line completely. But it wasn't the fear or guilt that filled him. It was exhilaration. For a moment, he stood over her, watching her body, still and pale, the way he had watched the others before her. He had taken control. Again. But then, as the seconds ticked by, something started to shift. The house seemed colder now. The air felt thick, suffocating. Daniel looked around, his eyes darting from the walls to the corners of the room. He was suddenly aware of every sound. Every creak in the floorboards. The whisper of wind outside. The faint rustle of curtains moving slightly in the breeze. Something wasn't right. A voice in his head whispered, faint but growing louder with each passing second. "You've gone too far." But Daniel ignored it, pushing the thought away. He couldn't stop now. He had come so far. The weight of his past actions settled on him, and he pushed it all to the back of his mind. It didn't matter anymore. Daniel walked away from Clara's body, stepping over the pool of blood, the stain of his deeds marking the floor. His mind raced. The other wives, the ones he had gotten rid of, they were gone, erased from the world. But the house still felt like it was closing in on him. He didn't feel as invincible as he had before. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the walls were watching him. The chill in the air grew colder. And then a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible knock. It came from the front door. Daniel froze. His heart skipped a beat.
Who could that be?
The silence around him seemed to stretch, the knock echoing in his mind. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. Could it be the police? Could someone have found out? But then, a second knock, louder this time. It was real. Someone was at the door. His pulse quickened. Daniel took a step back, his mind racing. Who was there? What if someone knew? The knock came again, followed by a voice. It was faint, but unmistakable. Daniel opened the door. The voice. It wasn't just anyone. It was Sarah, his first wife. Her voice, soft and chilling, echoed through the hallway. His blood ran cold. There was no way. She was gone. She had disappeared years ago. Hadn't she? The air in the house seemed to grow colder still. The knock came again. A sound like a hammer hitting his chest. A final warning. And then the door creaked open on its own. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest, but his feet refused to move. The door opened slowly, creaking on its hinges. The shadow standing in the doorway was a silhouette. But the figure was unmistakable. It was Sarah. Her face, pale and lifeless, stared back at him. Her eyes, empty and hollow, locked onto his with an eerie, cold stare. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't possible. The room felt as though it was spinning. The shadow moved, stepping closer. He could feel her presence, cold and haunting, like a ghost walking toward him. The darkness in the room seemed to grow, swallowing everything around him. And then, without a word, Sarah raised her hand. And in it, the unmistakable gleam of a knife. Daniel's body froze in terror. The knife gleamed in Sarah's ghostly hand, its blade reflecting the dim light of the room. His heart thundered in his chest as he tried to move, but his legs wouldn't obey. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but the air in the room was thick, suffocating. Sarah's hollow eyes never left his. She stepped closer, her feet barely touching the floor as she moved like a shadow. Her presence was cold, unnaturally so, and the chill seeped into his bones. The silence was deafening, broken only by the slow, deliberate scraping of the knife against the floor. Daniel wanted to speak, to shout, to beg for mercy, but his voice was locked in his throat. The horror of what he was seeing, what he had done, was too much to bear. He had killed her once, but now she was back. And this time, he didn't know how to escape. The ghost of his first wife stepped into the room fully, her body ethereal, translucent, like a wisp of smoke.
She didn't speak.
There was no need. Her cold, dead eyes told him everything he needed to know. He had taken so much from her. He had killed her. And now, she had returned for revenge. He wanted to run, to scream, but something was holding him in place.
Fear.
The deep, primal fear of being hunted by the very soul he had wronged. With each step she took, the room seemed to grow darker, more suffocating. The walls felt as if they were closing in, and Daniel's breath became shallow. "Why?" he finally choked out, his voice trembling with dread. Sarah didn't answer.
She didn't need to.
The knife in her hand gleamed brighter, its edge sharp and unforgiving. She raised it higher, her movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. The air grew colder still. Daniel's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to defend himself with. But there was nothing. Just Sarah and the knife. The fear inside him exploded into panic. He tried to speak again, to plead with her, but his voice caught. It was as if the very air was choking him. The blade in her hand gleamed in the pale light, and Sarah moved closer still. Her face remained expressionless, her eyes dead. And then, with one swift movement, she lunged. The knife flashed through the air. Daniel didn't have time to react. He felt the cold steel against his skin, slicing through him with a precision that only death could bring. A gasp escaped his lips as he staggered backward, pain searing through his body. The blood flowed, warm and thick, pooling around his feet. He stumbled, trying to stay on his feet, but his legs gave way beneath him. The world around him blurred as his vision faded. He collapsed to the floor, his breath ragged. His mind spun, his thoughts scattered. And through the fog of pain and fear, he heard it. A whisper. Soft, chilling. "You should never have killed me." It was Sarah's voice, distant but clear, as if the very walls were speaking. And in that moment, as the darkness swallowed him whole, Daniel realized something. There was no escape. No running. The consequences of his actions had caught up to him. And now, there was no one left to save him. The darkness closed in, thick and suffocating. Daniel's vision was blurred, the edges of his world starting to dissolve into nothingness. The cold seeped into his bones as the life drained from his body. He tried to lift his hand, to grasp at something, anything, but it was as if his body had turned to stone. The room was spinning, the walls narrowing, pressing in on him. But there was no escape. He could hear the faint echo of Sarah's voice, still whispering in his mind. Her words were like a chilling breeze, cutting through him with the sharpness of a blade. "You should never have killed me." And in that moment, Daniel knew the truth. This wasn't over. It could never be over. His soul would never rest. The consequences of his actions, his murders, had already begun to haunt him. And it was only the beginning. As the darkness crept into his consciousness, he felt a cold hand wrap around his wrist. It was like ice, a frozen grip that held him in place. He could no longer move, no longer speak. The pain in his chest was unbearable, but he could not fight it anymore. And then he heard it. A faint rustling, like a whisper carried by the wind. More footsteps. More shadows. More voices. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them closing in, surrounding him. He could hear the faint breath of others, women's voices, low and hollow, whispering his name. His heart hammered in his chest as he tried to move, to break free. But there was no escape. It was too late. His past had caught up to him. The voices grew louder, overlapping, as if dozens of people were calling to him. Whispers of his wives, his victims.
Sarah, Emma,
Rachel, Clara. Each name was like a dagger to his soul. Each voice filled with pain, with betrayal, with regret. "You killed us. You left us. You betrayed us." The whispers echoed in his mind, swirling around him like a storm. And then suddenly everything stopped. The silence was deafening. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was suffocating. The room felt colder than ever, and the shadows seemed to grow, stretching out toward him. Daniel's breath hitched in his throat, his body trembling as the presence of his past weighed down on him. He could feel them, his wives, around him, their spirits watching, waiting. And just as he thought he might lose himself completely, a voice cut through the stillness. One last whisper. "I will never let you go." It was Sarah. Her voice was the last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him whole. And then there was nothing. The void was absolute. There was no light, no sound, no sense of time. Daniel drifted in the endless blackness, his mind numb, as if his very soul had been torn from his body. He could no longer feel the floor beneath him, the air around him. He was weightless, suspended in nothingness. But then a flicker, a pulse of light. It wasn't much, just a brief, faint glow, but it pierced through the darkness like a distant star. Daniel's mind clung to it, grasping at it in desperation, as if it were his only lifeline. The light grew brighter, pulling him forward, but he didn't know where it would lead. His heart hammered in his chest, but he couldn't move, couldn't make himself reach it. The pull was powerful, and yet the fear that clawed at him was even stronger. He could hear faint whispers again. They were soft at first, barely perceptible, but they grew louder. Echoes of voices. He recognized them.
Sarah. Emma.
Rachel. Clara. Their voices echoed in the dark, the same haunting words repeating over and over. "You killed us. You betrayed us. Now you'll pay." The light was growing brighter now, but Daniel felt no closer to it. His body ached with an unfamiliar weight, as if he were being dragged backward into the shadows. His thoughts were jumbled, frantic. He wanted to escape. He wanted to run from those voices, from his own guilt. But it was as if the darkness was alive, holding him in place, refusing to let him go. And then, with a jolt, the darkness cracked open. Not a flash of light, but a tearing, like the fabric of reality itself was being ripped apart. Suddenly, Daniel was back. But not in the way he expected. The air was heavy, thick with a dampness that clung to his skin. He was standing, but it wasn't his home. He didn't recognize this place. It was a graveyard. The ground was wet, the graves old and worn. The tombstones loomed above him, jagged and twisted. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the earth itself was rejecting him. But then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging through the wet ground. He turned, and his blood ran cold. There, standing among the gravestones, was Sarah. Her face, pale and lifeless, was twisted in a look of pure malice. Behind her, Emma, Rachel, Clara, all of them. Their faces were hollow, their eyes empty, lifeless, but they stared at him with unyielding anger. The air was thick with their presence. They were not dead. Not anymore. They were here. And they were not alone. The shadows around them seemed to pulse, moving with an unnatural rhythm. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had made a mistake he could never undo. As the ghosts of his past closed in, their voices grew louder, merging into a single, powerful chorus. "You will never escape us." And with that, the ground beneath Daniel's feet cracked open, swallowing him whole. The last thing he heard was the echo of their voices, the weight of his sins, the relentless pursuit of the darkness he could never outrun. And then there was nothing. The nothingness consumed him completely. Daniel had no sense of time, no awareness of anything outside of the suffocating black void. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating every thought. But then, an eerie sensation crept through the void, a faint pulling, like a rope dragging him deeper into the dark. It wasn't the relief of escape, nor the dread of further torment. It was something far worse. It was the feeling of being watched. His heart raced as a familiar chill ran down his spine, the cold breath of the past curling around him like 1,000 whispers. He tried to scream, but his voice was gone, swallowed by the abyss. The pull grew stronger, and suddenly, without warning, he was thrown forward, his body crashing into something solid. His hands scraped against stone, rough and cold. He gasped, inhaling air, thick and heavy, filling his lungs with a desperate rush. It wasn't the void anymore. He was somewhere else. His eyes blinked open, but everything was blurry, a distorted haze. Slowly, his senses returned, though the disorientation was overwhelming. The faint sound of water lapping at the shore, the rustle of wind through dry leaves, and then the smell. It was an overwhelming stench of decay, the kind that clung to your skin and made you gag. As his vision cleared, Daniel saw the scene around him. A vast graveyard. But it wasn't like any graveyard he had ever seen before. The tombstones were crooked, toppled, and cracked. Moss grew thick on the worn-out stone. The air was still, suffocating. And above, the sky was thick with clouds, oppressive and dark. He tried to move, but his body felt sluggish, as though it had been submerged in cold water for too long. A cold gust of wind swept through the cemetery, and in the distance, a faint figure appeared. At first, it was just a shape, like a shadow drifting through the mist. But then, the figure came into focus. It was Sarah. Her translucent form glowed faintly against the darkness, her features cold and rigid. Her eyes locked with his, but they weren't filled with rage now. They were empty, hollow. And, in that moment, Daniel knew. The torment he had been running from, the one that had followed him through every twisted moment of his life. This was it. This was where it ended. But it didn't feel like an end. It felt like the beginning. Behind Sarah, the other women appeared. Emma, Rachel, and Clara. Each one of them stood silently, their eyes as vacant as Sarah's, but there was no mistaking the pain in their faces. The silent accusation, the betrayal that lingered in their stare. And then, a soft voice broke the stillness. "You thought you could outrun us." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, every part of him screaming to run, to escape. But the ground beneath him wouldn't allow it. The earth seemed to pulse with an ancient force, like it was alive, watching. The wind howled louder, the spirits closing in. And Daniel could hear it now, clearer than ever. A whisper, a haunting whisper from the grave. "You're not free. You'll never be free." The darkness around him began to shift, the shapes of the spirits swirling in an endless loop. The graveyard began to breathe. The earth itself seemed to shift beneath him, as if the dead were coming alive to claim him. He wanted to scream, but his throat was tight, suffocating, as though he were being crushed from all sides. And then a figure appeared in the distance. A dark shape, towering above the others, coming closer with every step. It was no longer just Sarah. No, it was something far worse. It was them. All of them. The very souls of the women he had murdered were coming for him. He tried to move, but his legs were frozen in place. They surrounded him, closing in, the cold touch of their ghostly hands seeping through his skin. And then, with a final breath, the ground gave way. The earth cracked open, and Daniel fell deeper and deeper. The voices, the whispers, the cold, everything closed in on him, and he realized then, there was no escape. There never had been. The darkness had always been waiting. Daniel plummeted through the infinite void, the air rushing past him like a cold, biting wind. The fall seemed endless, each moment stretching into eternity, as if time itself had lost all meaning. His body ached with a weight he could not comprehend, but his mind was numb, detached from the reality he once knew. There was nothing but the oppressive darkness, and yet, in that black void, the whispers grew louder. They surrounded him. They filled his head, their voices like 1,000 needles piercing his thoughts. "You thought you could escape," they murmured in unison. You thought you could run. The voices of Sarah, Emma, Rachel, Clara, they were all there, their words taunting, accusing, relentless. Each word struck him like a blow, a reminder of the horrors he had committed, the lives he had destroyed. But as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, something changed. A faint flicker of light appeared in the distance, like a distant star in the vastness of space. At first, it was small, just a spark in the endless dark, but it grew, inch by inch, drawing closer, brighter. Daniel's body was still weightless, but the light was pulling him toward it, dragging him closer. He tried to resist. He tried to turn away, to flee from whatever awaited him at the source of that light. But it was no use. The pull was too strong. As he was pulled closer, the whispers faded, replaced by a new sound. A soft, eerie hum. It was like a lullaby, sweet, haunting, and impossible to ignore. The light grew brighter still, now blinding, searing through the darkness around him. And then suddenly he was there, standing at the center of an endless field, bathed in an unnatural glow. The light wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from the earth beneath him, rising from the ground like fire. The field stretched out before him, barren and desolate, the soil cracked and dry. And then, slowly, the faces began to form. One by one, they emerged from the ground, faint, translucent figures, rising like ghosts from the earth. It was them again.
Sarah, Emma,
Rachel,
Clara.
But they weren't just specters anymore. They were part of the land, part of the darkness. Their faces twisted with anger and sorrow, their eyes hollow, empty of all humanity. And in that moment, Daniel understood. The field wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a place of eternal torment, where the souls of his victims were bound to the earth, just as he was now bound to them. There was no escape. He had entered a place where time did not exist, where the living and the dead could never truly part. And as the spirits surrounded him, their hollow eyes watching, Daniel felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. The light was fading now, the air growing colder, heavier. He could feel their cold hands reaching for him, their fingers brushing against his skin, seeping into his very being. "You'll never leave," they whispered in unison. Their voices were everywhere, in his ears, in his mind, filling him with the realization of his eternal fate. The earth beneath him trembled, as if it, too, had a pulse, a heartbeat that was in sync with his own.
He was no longer falling.
He was trapped. The land was alive, and it had claimed him. Daniel screamed. He screamed for the first time in what felt like forever. But the ground swallowed his scream, just as it had swallowed his soul. And in that moment, he understood the true horror. There was no death here, only endless suffering. The faces of his victims swirled around him, their forms flickering like dying flames. They were not gone. They were here, with him, forever. And Daniel knew, deep in his bones, that he would never, ever escape the hell he had made for himself. In the end, there was no redemption, no forgiveness, only the cold, endless night, and the echoes of those he had wronged. Forever. The darkness pressed in around him like an all-encompassing weight, suffocating, oppressive. Daniel stood motionless, his body frozen in place by the relentless grip of the land beneath him. The figures of Sarah, Emma, Rachel, and Clara circled him, their ghostly forms flickering like broken shadows. Their eyes, empty and cold, never left him. He could feel their gaze piercing into his soul, each one a dagger of guilt that twisted deeper with every passing second. The field stretched endlessly in every direction, barren and lifeless. The air was thick with the stench of decay, as if the very ground beneath him had absorbed the pain and suffering of countless souls. And then, a voice broke through the silence. It was Sarah's voice. Soft at first, like a distant whisper, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. You thought you could bury us, she said, her words echoing across the desolate landscape. You thought you could escape the consequences. But you were wrong. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His heart hammered in his chest as the realization hit him. There was no escape. No second chance. The spirits closed in on him, their faces twisted in anger, in sorrow, in unyielding fury. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble, as if the earth itself was alive, watching, judging. Look at us, Emma's voice joined in, sharp and bitter. You took everything from us. And now you'll pay. Daniel's mind raced, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic frenzy. He had thought that death would bring an end to his suffering, that the ghosts of his past would finally be silenced. But this was far worse than he could have imagined. This wasn't death. This was something worse. A prison. A torment that would never end. The spirits reached out to him, their cold, ethereal hands grazing his skin. Their touch sent a chill that cut straight through to his bones. You will never know peace, Rachel whispered, her voice like a cold wind. You will never be free. Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but his body refused to move. It was as if the very air had wrapped around him, holding him captive. Clara's voice joined the chorus, a soft, mournful wail. You can't escape us. We are the echoes of your sins. We are the ones you betrayed. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were all speaking at once, their voices blending into a single, overwhelming cacophony. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse with each word, as if the earth itself was alive, feeding off the energy of their torment. Daniel's vision blurred. His mind screamed for release, but the pain, the regret, the horror of what he had done, it all clawed at him, tearing him apart from the inside. And then, just as he thought he might break, the whispers fell silent. The spirits stopped moving. The cold air froze in place. And for a brief moment, the world held its breath. The silence was deafening. But it was not a relief. It was suffocating. Daniel felt the weight of their judgment, their presence, hanging over him like a heavy fog. There was no escape, no redemption, no forgiveness. He had killed them, and now they were his only company, forever. The silence stretched on, heavy and unyielding. It was as if time had stopped, leaving Daniel suspended in a world without end. The absence of sound made his heart race louder, his every breath a reminder of his isolation. The spirits surrounded him, their presence like a cold, unrelenting shadow, but their eyes, those hollow eyes, no longer screamed with fury. Now they just stared. Daniel wanted to look away, to escape their gaze. But he couldn't. Their eyes, lifeless yet piercing, held him in place, as if they could see into the deepest parts of him, into the darkness of his very soul. He had betrayed them,
Murdered them.
and now there was no forgiveness, no redemption. As the minutes, hours, or maybe years seemed to drag on, the world around him began to shift once more. The ground beneath his feet started to crack open, slowly at first, then faster, the earth splitting apart with a low, guttural rumble. The fissures widened, and from them, pale hands, thin and brittle, began to emerge, clawing their way up from the earth. He could feel the ground shift beneath him, as if it were trying to swallow him whole. The hands reached up, cold as ice, their fingers curling around his legs, pulling at him with an unrelenting force. He tried to pull away, to break free, but his body was heavy, as though it were being weighed down by chains. His heart raced. His mind screamed. But the earth was relentless. The hands tightened their grip, dragging him deeper, deeper into the earth, until the dirt filled his mouth and nose, suffocating him. Daniel could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. The ground felt alive, hungry. The spirits, Sarah, Emma, Rachel, Clara, Their faces, now twisted and deformed by the agony of their torment, hovered around him, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were no longer speaking, no longer whispering. They simply watched. And in that moment, Daniel understood. This was not punishment. This was eternity. His life, his choices had led him here. And now there would be no end. No final release. Only the suffocating embrace of the earth and the cold, endless stare of the spirits that would never leave him. The hands pulled him further down, their cold touch seeping into his skin, into his very bones. His body was sinking into the dirt, into the grave he had created for himself. His breath was shallow, the air growing thicker with every passing moment. The weight of his past, of his sins, pressed down on him harder than the earth itself. And then, just as he thought he could bear no more, he heard it. A voice, soft and cold, cutting through the suffocating silence. "You'll never be free. Not now. Not ever." It was Sarah's voice. The last thing Daniel felt before the earth swallowed him completely was the cold, dead touch of her hand on his shoulder. And then there was nothing. No air. No light. No sound, only the eternal darkness. He had become one with the earth, just as he had always been destined to. And in the end, his torment would never cease. The darkness that had swallowed Daniel seemed to stretch infinitely, pulling him deeper into the abyss. His body no longer felt like his own. It was as if it had melted away into the shadows. His mind, fractured and disjointed, could only grasp at fleeting thoughts, at the remnants of his past actions. He tried to fight it, to break free from the weight of the torment, but the shadows had a hold on him. It wasn't just the spirits anymore. It was everything. The land itself seemed to absorb him, claiming him as its own. His every breath was a struggle, each one suffocating, each one a reminder of the horrors he had inflicted. But then, amid the suffocating silence, something shifted. A flicker. A soft light appeared in the distance, faint but undeniable. At first, Daniel thought it was an illusion, a final trick of the mind before the darkness consumed him completely. But as he focused on it, the light grew stronger, brighter. It was coming toward him. His heart, still beating weakly within his chest, skipped a beat. Could it be? Was there hope after all? The light wrapped around him, soft and warm, pulling him from the clutches of the abyss. The weight of the shadows loosened, and the cold that had taken root in his bones began to dissipate. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Daniel could breathe without the suffocating pressure. He reached out, his trembling hand finding the warmth of the light, clinging to it as if it were his last chance. The spirits, the whispers, they were fading. The suffocating earth seemed to release its grip on him, and the cold hands of the dead loosened their hold. And then a voice. It wasn't the accusatory whispers of the women he had killed. It wasn't the chilling touch of their spirits. It was Sarah. But this time, her voice was different.
Softer.
Forgiving. "You can't change the past," she said, her words gentle. "But you can choose a different path now. It's not too late." The light around him pulsed, enveloping him in its warmth. The weight of guilt still lingered, but for the first time, Daniel felt something shift within him. He could choose. He could find redemption. For the first time, he felt hope. The light grew blinding, and then, with a final breath, Daniel stepped into it. And for the first time in an eternity, there was peace. The light surrounded Daniel completely, wrapping him in its warmth and radiance, casting away the suffocating darkness that had gripped him for so long. The weight of guilt, of his past, still lingered, but it no longer defined him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt free. He opened his eyes, blinking against the intensity of the light, and he found himself standing in a place that felt different. It was not the graveyard, nor the endless, suffocating void he had wandered in before. It was a tranquil landscape, bathed in a soft, golden glow. The air was warm and comforting, and the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers filled his lungs. The land before him was peaceful, lush with vibrant green fields and clear blue skies. It was the kind of place that felt alive with hope, a stark contrast to the barren graveyard he had left behind. For a moment, Daniel stood still, letting the peaceful surroundings wash over him. His heart slowed, the erratic pounding that had once consumed him now steady. The memories of the women, their faces, their voices lingered, but they no longer felt like chains. They were a part of him, but they no longer held him captive. He walked slowly through the field, feeling the earth beneath his feet, the warmth of the sun on his face. He could hear the sound of birdsong in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of clarity, as though a fog had been lifted from his mind. As he continued walking, he saw figures in the distance, shapes that slowly came into focus. One by one, they materialized.
Sarah, Emma,
Rachel,
Clara.
but they were not the hollow, vengeful spirits he had known. Their faces were calm, their eyes filled with something new, something like understanding, something like forgiveness. They did not speak. They didn't need to. Daniel understood now. The road to redemption was not an easy one. He could never undo the past. But here, in this peaceful place, he was given a chance to live without the constant weight of his sins. The journey was just beginning, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't walking alone. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a soft, golden hue over the land. And as the shadows stretched long, Daniel took his first step forward, not in fear, but in the quiet promise of a new beginning. And with that, the world faded into light, a final peace settling over him, as if the universe had finally forgiven him. The end.